Have you ever wondered, is living close to your children in old age really the best choice? It's a question many of us may have never dared to ask. Society, tradition, and family expectations often make us believe that staying near our children and grandchildren in our later years guarantees joy and happiness. But what if you were told that this very closeness could be slowly taking away the most precious things you have? Freedom, independence, and your true happiness. Could it be that the decisions made out of love may become a trap? Many people believe that sacrificing for family is a duty and the key to happiness in old age. But have you ever stopped to ask yourself, what happens when that sacrifice leads to the loss of your personal identity and freedom? Let's dive into the story of Sarah, an elderly woman who once believed that moving closer to her children was the best decision she had ever made. But soon, Sarah would come to realize that along the way, she had lost herself. In modern society, we often fall into a familiar mindset that old age must be tied to sacrificing for the next generation, and we feel guilty even at the thought of living for ourselves. But pause for a moment and reflect. Are you living your own life, or are you merely living according to what others expect of you? Sarah, a loving grandmother, had everything she could wish for. Children, grandchildren, and a home filled with laughter. But then, little by little, the joy of this closeness began to fade. It was replaced by invisible responsibilities and the slow disappearance of her personal freedom. Sarah started to wonder if this was the life she truly wanted for the rest of her days. Are you living your life, or are you caught in a cycle of unspoken obligations? If you've ever felt like this, then Sarah's story may mirror your own. Perhaps, like Sarah, you too have slowly lost your sense of identity, as your life has been shaped by the decisions of others. Growing older doesn't mean you have to give up your independence. True freedom isn't about living near others, but lies in the ability to control your own life, even in your later years. Sarah once believed that sacrifice was the only path to happiness. But the truth is, sometimes we need to learn to let go in order to rediscover ourselves. Sarah's life began to change one autumn afternoon when her old friend Carol came to visit. Carol, who had chosen to live independently after her husband passed away, opened up a whole new door for Sarah. A way of living that Sarah had never dared to consider. This encounter forced Sarah to confront truths she had been avoiding for a long time. Sometimes, love and the desire to help our family can lead us to lose ourselves. What happens when you dare to face the limits you've set for yourself? What could change if you dared to reclaim your freedom instead of constantly living up to others' expectations? Sarah was ready for her new journey. Are you? If you've ever felt trapped in decisions that weren't truly your own, then Sarah's story is for you. Don't hesitate, hit like, subscribe, and share this video so together we can rediscover true freedom and joy in our lives. Part 1. The Dream of Being Close to Family. Sarah had spent her entire life taking care of her family, raising her children, and being a devoted wife. After her husband passed away, she felt an overwhelming emptiness, a deep void that no amount of distractions could fill. The long, lonely days stretched ahead of her, and it wasn't long before Sarah began thinking about her future. She asked herself, could there be anything more fulfilling than being surrounded by the ones I love most? Watching my children and grandchildren grow every day, being part of their lives, wouldn't that bring me joy and purpose in my final years? To Sarah, the answer seemed simple. Moving in with her daughter Rebecca, who had 2 young children, felt like the most logical step. They need me, and I need them, Sarah would often tell herself, convincing her heart that this would be the best decision for everyone. She imagined cozy family dinners, weekend walks with her grandchildren, and the echo of laughter filling the house. These dreams of a warm, loving household reassured her that she was making the right choice. The prospect of moving in with Rebecca didn't just offer Sarah joy, but also the opportunity to show her love by being useful. She pictured herself waking up early, preparing breakfast for the family, and receiving warm hugs from the children as they greeted her each morning. The idea of telling bedtime stories and watching the family grow together brought a sense of fulfillment that she had long craved. She was excited about the life that awaited her, one filled with love, togetherness, and a renewed sense of purpose. When Sarah first moved in, everything unfolded just as she had imagined. On the first evening, she and Rebecca cooked dinner together, sharing laughs over old memories. As the entire family sat down to eat, Sarah felt a deep joy. "This is what I've been missing all those lonely months," she thought, watching the smiles of her grandchildren and the peaceful happiness on her daughter's face. The sounds of laughter and the feeling of being needed filled her soul, as if she had finally found the place where she truly belonged. But Sarah's decision wasn't purely driven by love. After her husband's death, she had developed a fear of isolation. The thought of slipping into a quiet, uneventful life where no one needed her anymore haunted her. Living close to her children seemed like the perfect way to stay connected to life itself, a way to ensure she still had purpose and value. It wasn't just a matter of proximity. It was about reclaiming the sense of importance she feared she had lost. Rebecca, Sarah's daughter, was equally thrilled to have her mother nearby. However, deep down, Rebecca carried her own unspoken concerns. While she loved her mother dearly and was grateful for her presence, she also worried about whether this move would truly make Sarah happy in the long run. Would her mother feel content in this new chapter of life? Would Sarah, who had once been so independent, find satisfaction in living under someone else's roof? These questions lingered in Rebecca's mind, but neither mother nor daughter voiced their concerns. Instead, they both chose to focus on the positives, and in the beginning, everything did feel perfect. The first few mornings after Sarah moved in, she woke up with a sense of renewal. The house was filled with love. She prepared breakfast with a youthful energy she hadn't felt in years. The grandchildren clung to her as if she were their favorite person in the world, while Rebecca hustled through her busy workday. Sarah felt like an integral part of the family, as though her presence had brought a new harmony to their lives. In the evenings, they all gathered around the dinner table. Sarah shared stories from her past, spoke fondly of her late husband, and the grandchildren hung on every word. Rebecca frequently thanked her mother for helping around the house, and Sarah felt a swelling pride in being useful again. These were the moments Sarah had longed for. They were moments that filled the house with warmth and made her believe that her decision had been the right one. Rebecca and Sarah appeared to grow closer than ever. When they lived apart, they constantly missed each other, calling to check in frequently. But now, with Sarah living under the same roof, their bond felt deeper. Sarah was no longer just a visitor. She was part of the day-to-day rhythm of Rebecca's life. And this closeness brought Sarah a profound sense of peace. However, life isn't always made up of sweet, idealized moments. With closeness comes responsibility, and often tensions that no one anticipates. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah began to notice that her freedom was slowly slipping away. She loved her family deeply, but with that love came hidden, unspoken responsibilities. What began as small joys like preparing breakfast gradually became routine tasks. Weekends that once held the promise of fun with the grandchildren started turning into an endless cycle of family obligations. Rebecca, overwhelmed by her demanding job, began to rely more and more on her mother. At first, it was small favors, like asking Sarah to watch the kids while she ran errands. But soon, Sarah found herself caught in the daily grind of family life, without any time left for herself. She was always helping, always available. Slowly but surely, Sarah's sense of personal space and time diminished. And then the doubt crept in. Is this what I wanted? Is this the life I dreamed of? Sarah began asking herself, though she kept her thoughts to herself, not wanting to burden her daughter. Her desire to be close to her family, which had once been her dream, was now starting to feel like a trap. The freedom she once cherished was slipping away, replaced by a schedule she hadn't anticipated. one dictated by her family's needs rather than her own. As much as Sarah loved her family, she was starting to realize that closeness sometimes came with a hidden cost. It wasn't that anyone was intentionally demanding too much of her. Rather, it was the invisible expectations that settled around her like a weight she hadn't expected to carry. Without anyone noticing, Sarah's time for herself, time to read, to take long walks, to simply be alone with her thoughts, had disappeared. Her days now belonged to her family, and with that loss of time came a deeper sense of loss. She felt as though she was losing part of herself. Rebecca, caught up in the whirlwind of her own responsibilities, had no idea her mother was struggling. Sarah, out of love and a desire not to upset her daughter, never mentioned how overwhelmed she felt. Yet the more Sarah gave, the more a subtle loneliness grew within her heart. She started to see that closeness doesn't always equate to happiness. Sometimes, distance is necessary to maintain one's independence and sense of self. But what happens when closeness begins to feel like a burden? Sarah's story doesn't end with the early moments of joy. As the days passed, she started to realize that she was losing more than she had ever imagined. Let's continue following Sarah's journey, from the joy of being near her family to the feeling of losing her freedom, and explore whether she can rediscover herself amidst the life she thought she wanted. Part 2. The quiet pressures of family life. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah's initial joy of living with her daughter Rebecca and grandchildren slowly began to fade. What had once been a dream of warmth, love, and family closeness started to feel more like an obligation. The daily cycle of cooking, cleaning, and caregiving became her new routine, leaving little room for herself. Sarah had imagined she'd have more time to relax, enjoy peaceful mornings, and reflect on life. But her reality was turning out quite differently. At first, Sarah was happy to be helpful. She loved preparing meals for Rebecca's family, cleaning up after the children, and being there for them. It gave her a sense of purpose, of being needed. However, it wasn't long before these small acts of kindness turned into daily, unspoken expectations. What began as a joy became a weight she wasn't prepared for. The shift happened gradually, as it often does in family life. One morning, as Sarah prepared breakfast for the children, she realized she hadn't had a moment to herself since moving in. Her once peaceful mornings, where she'd sip tea and watch the birds outside her window, were now filled with bustling activity. The children's laughter, which had initially brought her so much happiness, now felt like background noise to the endless tasks that needed to be done. One quiet afternoon, when the house was finally still, Sarah sat down with a cup of tea. She looked out the window, watching the wind sway the trees, and found herself reflecting on the life she had before moving in with Rebecca. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. She had the freedom to spend her days as she wished. Now, even something as simple as sitting in silence felt like a rare luxury. Her mind wandered back to the afternoons she used to spend at the local cafe with her book club, or the leisurely walks she'd take through the park. Sarah sighed, wondering when she had lost herself in this well-meaning arrangement. She loved her family deeply, but her days now revolved around their needs. The small joys that had once filled her life had been replaced by an overwhelming sense of duty. And while Rebecca appreciated her help, she had come to rely on it so much that Sarah felt trapped in a routine that was no longer her own. One Saturday afternoon, as Sarah was tidying up after lunch, Rebecca rushed into the kitchen, visibly stressed. "Mom, can you watch the kids for a few hours? I have to run out and finish some errands," she asked, barely making eye contact. "Of course," Sarah replied, though a hint of weariness touched her voice. Rebecca was already out the door before Sarah had a chance to say anything more. As she cleaned the kitchen, she realized she hadn't been asked, it was simply expected. It had become a regular occurrence, and Sarah couldn't remember the last time she had a full afternoon to herself. Later that evening, as Sarah tucked her grandchildren into bed, the youngest, Lily, looked up at her and said, "Grandma, you're always here. Don't you ever get tired?" The innocent question hit Sarah harder than she expected. She smiled down at Lily, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "Sometimes, sweetie, but I'm here because I love you." But that night, Sarah lay awake in bed, thinking about Lily's question. Didn't she ever get tired? The answer was yes. She was tired, not just physically, but emotionally too. The constant demands of family life were beginning to take a toll on her. She hadn't realized it fully until now. Sarah's love for her family made it hard for her to speak up about her growing frustration. She felt guilty even thinking about it. After all, wasn't this what she had wanted? To be close to her children and grandchildren in her later years? To be needed? Yet the constant caregiving, the unspoken responsibilities, and the lack of personal time were slowly chipping away at her sense of independence. She started feeling invisible, as if her role in the family had reduced her to little more than a caregiver. Sarah's once vibrant personality, full of interests and hobbies, had been overshadowed by her duties. And the guilt, oh the guilt, was relentless. Every time she thought about asking for more time for herself, she quickly dismissed it. How could she? Wasn't this her job now? Wasn't this what it meant to be a good mother and grandmother? But the inner conflict grew stronger each day. One afternoon, Sarah finally mustered the courage to talk to Rebecca. It wasn't an easy conversation to start, but she knew it was necessary. "Rebecca," Sarah began as they sat down for a cup of tea after the kids had gone to bed. "I need to talk to you about something." Rebecca looked up, concern flashing in her eyes. "Is everything okay, Mom?" "I love being here, with you and the kids," Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm. "But I've been feeling overwhelmed lately. I don't have much time for myself anymore, and I'm beginning to feel like I've lost a part of who I am." Rebecca's face softened, but there was also a hint of surprise. "Mom, I didn't realize. You've been such a big help, and I just assumed you were happy being here." "I am," Sarah assured her. "But I also need some time to myself, time to rest, to do the things I love. I don't want to be just the grandmother who's always here to help. I need to find a balance." Rebecca nodded slowly, taking in her mother's words. "I had no idea you felt this way. I'm sorry, Mom. I never meant for you to feel like this was a burden." That conversation marked a turning point for Sarah. It wasn't that she wanted to leave her family or stop helping, but she needed to regain some of the independence she had lost. She began to set small boundaries. She decided to spend a few mornings each week at the local park, where she could sit quietly and read, just like she used to. She also rejoined her book club, a small but significant step towards reclaiming a piece of her old life. As Sarah began to take back some of her time, she noticed a shift in herself. She felt lighter, more in control. The invisible weight she had been carrying for months started to lift. She wasn't just the caretaker anymore. She was herself again, even if only for a few hours a day. Rebecca, too, noticed the change in her mother. She had always appreciated Sarah's help, but now she began to see how much her mother had sacrificed. Rebecca started to make adjustments as well, being more mindful of her mother's needs and offering her more time for herself. Despite the small changes, Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. She still had a long way to go in fully regaining her sense of self. But now, at least, she had taken the first steps. She had learned that, while love and family were important, so was her own independence. Living close to her family didn't mean she had to give up her freedom. It meant finding a balance between helping those she loved and taking care of herself. Sarah's journey was far from over, but now she felt empowered to continue, knowing that she could find happiness without sacrificing her identity. As the pressures of family life began to lift, Sarah started to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Hope that she could still enjoy these later years of her life on her own terms. She had begun to see that love didn't mean giving up everything for others. It meant taking care of yourself too. Sarah's story continues, and in the next chapter, we'll see how she faces the next set of challenges as she strives to strike a balance between family and her own happiness. What happens when love and obligation collide? Will Sarah find a way to reclaim her freedom without losing her family's love? Let's follow her as she navigates the complexities of family life and her own quest for independence. Part 3. The feeling of being bound. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Sarah slowly began to feel like a shadow of her former self. The vibrant, independent woman who once had her own dreams and hobbies was now buried beneath the weight of family obligations. Every morning when she woke up, it wasn't her own plans she thought about. It was the needs of others, the demands of the day ahead. The realization was creeping in, little by little, that she had given too much of herself, and in doing so, had forgotten who she truly was. When Sarah first moved in with Rebecca, she had been excited about the prospect of being close to her family. She imagined quiet mornings spent with her grandchildren, afternoons filled with laughter, and evenings surrounded by the warmth of family love. But over time, the demands of living under the same roof with her daughter and grandchildren began to take their toll. The small tasks that she had once eagerly taken on, cooking meals, helping with homework, tidying up the house, slowly turned into expectations. Her days had become a monotonous routine. Instead of spending time pursuing her passions, she found herself overwhelmed by the constant responsibilities of daily life. The joy she once felt in helping out was now replaced by a feeling of obligation, and that sense of duty began to weigh heavily on her heart. What once felt like a blessing, being close to her loved ones, had begun to feel like a cage. The vibrant woman who had loved reading novels, taking long walks, and painting had been replaced by someone who barely recognized herself in the mirror. Sarah no longer had the time or the energy to pursue the things she loved. Every day was the same. Wake up early, prepare breakfast, clean the kitchen, help with the children, and then move on to the next task. There was no end in sight, and with every passing day, Sarah felt more and more like she was losing herself. She didn't complain, though. She told herself that this was what it meant to be a good mother and grandmother. She had spent her entire life caring for others, and now that she was older, she believed that it was still her role. But deep down, Sarah knew something was wrong. She just couldn't bring herself to admit it. Not yet. One evening, after the children had gone to bed and the house was finally quiet, Sarah sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. She stared out the window at the night sky, lost in her thoughts. As she sat there, she began to reflect on her life, on the woman she used to be before her husband passed away. She thought about the dreams she once had, the hobbies she used to enjoy, and the sense of freedom she had once taken for granted. Sarah had always been an independent woman. Even in her marriage, she had made time for herself, for her own interests and pursuits. But now, that independence felt like a distant memory. She thought about the books she used to read, stacked neatly on a shelf but now gathering dust. She hadn't touched a novel in months. She thought about the long walks she used to take every morning, breathing in the fresh air and enjoying the beauty of nature. Now, the only walking she did was from room to room, cleaning up after everyone else. And then there was her painting. Sarah had always loved to paint. It had been her way of expressing herself, of capturing the beauty of the world around her. But her easel now sat abandoned in a corner of the living room, untouched since she moved in with Rebecca. Sarah sighed, feeling a pang of sadness in her chest. She realized, in that quiet moment, just how much she had given up. It wasn't just her time or her energy. It was her very sense of self. The dreams and hobbies that had once defined her had been pushed aside, replaced by the needs of her family. And while she loved her family more than anything, Sarah couldn't help but feel that she had lost a part of herself in the process. Sarah had always believed that self-sacrifice was a virtue. She had been raised to believe that taking care of others was the most important thing a woman could do. Her mother had done the same for her, and she had always admired her mother for it. But now, Sarah was beginning to question that belief. She had sacrificed so much of herself for her family, but at what cost? She began to wonder if it was possible to love and care for others without losing yourself in the process. Was it possible to be a good mother and grandmother while still maintaining your own identity? Sarah wasn't sure. All she knew was that she was tired. Tired of the constant demands of feeling like she had no control over her own life. Tired of feeling like she was disappearing. She longed for a sense of balance, a way to care for her family without sacrificing her own happiness. But she didn't know how to achieve that balance. She had spent so many years putting others first that she wasn't sure how to put herself first anymore. One of the most difficult parts of Sarah's situation was the unspoken expectations that came with living with her daughter. Rebecca never explicitly asked Sarah to take on so many responsibilities, but over time, it became clear that she had come to rely on her mother's help. At first, Sarah didn't mind. She loved being there for her family, and she was happy to help out wherever she could. But as the months went on, Sarah began to feel like she was being taken for granted. Rebecca assumed that her mother would always be there to help with the children, to cook meals, to clean the house. It wasn't that Rebecca was ungrateful. She often thanked her mother for her help, but there was an unspoken understanding that Sarah would always be available, no matter what. Sarah began to feel like she had no choice in the matter. She didn't want to let her daughter down, and she certainly didn't want to abandon her grandchildren. But at the same time, she felt like she was losing herself in the process. She started to resent the fact that she never had any time for herself. She resented the fact that her own needs and desires were always pushed aside in favor of her family's. And most of all, she resented the fact that she felt guilty for even thinking about her own happiness. The emotional toll of Sarah's situation was starting to wear her down. She felt conflicted, torn between her love for her family and her growing need for independence. She didn't want to hurt Rebecca or the grandchildren, but she also didn't want to continue living a life that didn't feel like her own. The more Sarah thought about it, the more she realized that she needed to make a change. But change wasn't easy. Sarah had spent so many years taking care of others that she didn't know how to take care of herself anymore. She had spent so much time putting others first that she had forgotten how to put herself first. She knew that she needed to have a conversation with Rebecca, but she was afraid. What if Rebecca didn't understand? What if her daughter saw her need for independence as a rejection of the family? The thought of confronting Rebecca filled Sarah with anxiety. She didn't want to cause any tension or conflict, but she also knew that she couldn't keep going the way she was. Sarah spent many sleepless nights wrestling with her emotions, trying to figure out the best course of action. She knew that something had to change, but she didn't know how to make that change without hurting the people she loved. One afternoon, Sarah was sitting in the living room, flipping through an old photo album. As she looked at the pictures of herself from years ago, smiling, happy, full of life, she felt a pang of sadness. She didn't recognize the woman in the pictures anymore. She closed the album and sat back in her chair, lost in thought. It was in that moment that Sarah realized she couldn't keep living this way. She couldn't keep sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of her family. She needed to find a way to reclaim her sense of self, to rediscover the woman she used to be. But how? How could she do that without hurting the people she loved? Sarah didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew that she had to start somewhere. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. She couldn't keep pushing her own needs aside in favor of her family's. She had to find a way to strike a balance between being a loving mother and grandmother and being true to herself. Sarah took a deep breath and made a decision. She would talk to Rebecca, she would explain how she was feeling, and she would ask for the space and time she needed to rediscover herself. It wouldn't be easy, but Sarah knew that it was the only way forward. The next few days were filled with nervous anticipation as Sarah prepared to talk to Rebecca. She rehearsed what she would say, how she would explain her feelings without causing any hurt or misunderstanding. When the day finally came, Sarah sat down with her daughter over a cup of tea and spoke from her heart. "Rebecca," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I love you and the children more than anything. But I've been feeling like I've lost a part of myself since moving in with you. I need some time and space to rediscover who I am." Rebecca listened intently, her brow furrowed with concern. "I never realized, Mom," Rebecca said softly. "I've been so caught up in my own life that I didn't see what you were going through. I'm sorry." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. "I don't want to stop helping," Sarah continued, "but I need to find a balance. I need to take care of myself too." Rebecca nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "We'll figure it out, Mom," Rebecca said. "We'll find a way to make it work, for both of us." The conversation with Rebecca was a turning point for Sarah. It wasn't a complete solution, but it was a start. For the first time in months, Sarah felt like she was on the path to reclaiming her life. She began to set boundaries, taking time for herself each day, reconnecting with her old hobbies, and allowing herself the space to breathe. It wasn't easy, but Sarah was determined to find a way to be both a loving mother and grandmother, and a woman with her own dreams and desires. And as she took these small steps toward reclaiming her independence, Sarah began to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope that she could still live a fulfilling life, even in her later years. Hope that she could find a balance between caring for her family and caring for herself. And most of all, hope that she could rediscover the woman she used to be, the woman who was still there, just waiting to be found again. Part 4. The turning point in Sarah's life. After months of feeling weighed down by the silent pressures of family life, Sarah was at a crossroads. She loved her family deeply, but she couldn't shake the sense that she had lost a vital part of herself in the process of caring for them. Day by day, Sarah's identity seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the endless responsibilities that came with being a live-in grandmother. Her dreams, her hobbies, her independence, they all felt like distant memories. Then, one afternoon, something unexpected happened that would change the course of Sarah's life forever. The phone rang, and it was Carol, her closest friend for over 40 years. Carol had lived a different life after her husband passed away. Instead of moving in with her children like Sarah, Carol had chosen to live independently. Now in her mid-70s, she was thriving in a way that Sarah hadn't imagined possible. Carol's voice was warm and familiar on the other end of the line. After catching up on the usual topics, family, health, and grandchildren, Carol paused for a moment. Then, she asked a question that Sarah wasn't expecting. "Sarah, have you ever thought about living for yourself again?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah didn't know how to respond at first. Living for herself? It was such a foreign concept, especially after so many years of living for her family. She had always believed that her purpose in life was to care for others, to be a devoted wife, mother, and grandmother. But now, Carol was gently pushing her to think differently. "I know you love your family," Carol continued. "But what about you? What about your happiness, your freedom? When was the last time you did something just for yourself?" Sarah sat in silence, contemplating the question. When was the last time she had done something for herself? The truth was, she couldn't remember. Her days were so consumed with taking care of others that she had completely forgotten how to take care of herself. "Carol, I don't even know where to begin," Sarah finally admitted, her voice tinged with sadness. "I've been living with Rebecca and the kids for so long now. I don't even know who I am outside of this family. What would it look like to live for myself?" That's when Carol began to share her own story. A story of how she had made the bold decision to live independently after her husband passed away. At first, Carol had been tempted to move in with one of her children, just like Sarah had done. But something inside her told her that she needed to maintain her independence, even in her later years. It hadn't been an easy decision. Her children had worried about her living alone, especially as she got older. They had offered to have her move in, but Carol gently declined. She knew that if she moved in with them, she would lose a part of herself. She would become part of their routine, part of their daily lives. And she feared that her own desires and dreams would be overshadowed by the needs of the family. So instead, Carol found a small apartment nearby, close enough to visit her children and grandchildren often, but far enough to maintain her own space. And in that space, Carol began to rediscover herself. She took up hobbies she hadn't touched in years. She joined a book club, started gardening again, and even signed up for an art class at the local community center. She made new friends, traveled, and began to fill her days with activities that brought her joy. Living alone has given me a new sense of freedom, Carol explained. I've learned that independence isn't about being selfish. It's about giving yourself the space to grow, to explore, and to enjoy life on your own terms. I'm still close to my children, but I'm also living for me. As Sarah listened to Carol's story, she felt a flicker of hope ignite within her. Could she too find that kind of freedom? Could she carve out a life that was hers, without sacrificing her love for her family? That phone call planted a seed in Sarah's mind. For the first time in a long time, she began to entertain the idea that her life didn't have to revolve entirely around her family. She could still be a loving mother and grandmother, while also reclaiming her independence. But the thought of making such a drastic change terrified her. What would Rebecca say? How would the grandchildren react? Would they think she was abandoning them? Sarah didn't want to cause any tension or make her family feel like they had done something wrong. But at the same time, she knew she couldn't continue living a life that didn't feel like her own. Over the next few weeks, Sarah found herself daydreaming about what her life could look like if she made a change. She imagined waking up in her own apartment, surrounded by her favorite things. She imagined having the freedom to decide how to spend her days. Whether it was reading a good book, going for a walk, or pursuing her long-lost love of painting. She thought about the peace and quiet she would have. No more constant noise, no more feeling like she was always on call. She could still visit Rebecca and the grandchildren whenever she wanted, but she wouldn't have to be there every day, taking care of everyone else's needs before her own. The more Sarah thought about it, the more she realized that she wanted that life. She wanted to rediscover who she was outside of her role as a caregiver. She wanted to have space, both physical and emotional, to breathe, to reflect, and to grow. But wanting something and making it happen were two very different things. Sarah knew that if she was going to make a change, she would have to have a difficult conversation with Rebecca. And that thought filled her with dread. What if Rebecca didn't understand? What if she saw Sarah's desire for independence as a rejection of their family? What if the grandchildren felt abandoned? The last thing Sarah wanted was to hurt the people she loved. Still, Sarah couldn't ignore the feeling that had been growing inside her since that phone call with Carol. She knew that she had to have this conversation, no matter how difficult it might be. One evening, after the grandchildren had gone to bed, Sarah sat down with Rebecca at the kitchen table. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "Rebecca, there's something I need to talk to you about," Sarah began, her voice soft but firm. "I've been thinking a lot lately about my life, about how things have changed since I moved in with you. And as much as I love being here with you and the kids, I've started to realize that I need something more. I need some space for myself." Rebecca looked surprised, but she didn't interrupt. She could see the seriousness in her mother's eyes. "I'm not saying I want to move far away," Sarah continued, "but I think I need my own place, a place where I can have some time to myself, where I can do the things I love again. I'll still be close by, and I'll still be here for you and the kids whenever you need me, but I need to find a way to live for myself, too." There was a long pause as Rebecca processed what her mother had just said. Sarah held her breath, waiting for her daughter's response. Finally, Rebecca spoke. "Mom, I had no idea you were feeling this way," she said quietly. "I guess I've been so busy with my own life that I didn't realize how much you were giving up. I don't want you to feel like you have to take care of us all the time. If you need your own space, I understand." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. She hadn't realized how much tension she had been holding in until that moment. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I don't want you to feel like I'm abandoning you." Rebecca smiled, reaching across the table to take her mother's hand. "Of course I'm sure, Mom," she said. "You've done so much for us already. You deserve to have a life of your own. And honestly, I think it will be good for all of us. The kids will still get to see you all the time, but we'll all have a little more space." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was making a decision that was truly for her. And the fact that Rebecca understood and supported her made it all the more meaningful. With Rebecca's blessing, Sarah began the process of finding a place of her own. She looked for an apartment nearby, close enough to visit her family regularly, but far enough to create some space for herself. It wasn't long before she found the perfect place, a small, cozy apartment with a balcony that overlooked a park. It was nothing fancy, but it was hers. The moment she stepped inside, Sarah felt a sense of peace wash over her. She spent the next few weeks moving in, decorating the space with her favorite books, paintings, and mementos from her past. She set up her easel by the window, where the natural light poured in, and she bought a set of new paints and brushes, ready to rekindle her love of painting. For the first time in years, Sarah felt like she was in control of her own life again. She had space to think, to breathe, and to reflect. She had time to pursue her own interests without the constant demands of family life weighing her down. But most importantly, Sarah had rediscovered herself. And as she sat on her balcony, sipping tea and watching the world go by, she realized that this was what she had been missing all along. The freedom to live life on her own terms. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead. But Sarah knew that she had taken the first step toward living a life that was truly hers. And that was enough. In the end, it wasn't about abandoning her family or giving up her role as a mother and grandmother. It was about finding a balance between caring for the people she loved and caring for herself. And that, Sarah realized, was the key to living a fulfilling life in her later years. Sarah's story is a reminder that it's never too late to reclaim your independence. It's never too late to rediscover who you are and to start living life for yourself again. No matter how old you are, no matter what your circumstances may be, you deserve to have a life that is rich with meaning and joy, one that is not defined solely by the needs of others, but by your own dreams and desires. So if you find yourself feeling like Sarah did, lost in the responsibilities of family life, unsure of who you are outside of those roles, remember that it's never too late to make a change. You can still find a way to live for yourself, to pursue the things that make you happy, and to create a life that is truly yours. Because as Sarah learned, the greatest gift you can give to yourself and to your family is the gift of a life well lived. This is where Sarah's turning point leads her. And as we follow her journey toward independence, we begin to see that sometimes stepping away from those we love doesn't mean losing them. It means finding ourselves. Part 5. The decision to reclaim her freedom. As Sarah sat on her balcony one quiet morning, sipping tea and watching the sunlight dance through the leaves of the trees below, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. A sense of peace. It wasn't just the stillness of the morning or the beauty of the world around her that brought this feeling, but a quiet realization that had slowly been building in her heart. It was time to reclaim her freedom. Sarah had spent so many years devoting herself to others, first to her husband and children, and then to her grandchildren. She had always been the one who put everyone else's needs before her own, believing that was the only way to live a fulfilling life. But now, after years of giving and giving, Sarah had come to see that a fulfilling life didn't have to mean sacrificing everything for the sake of others. It was time to live for herself again. Sarah's moment of clarity had come gradually, but it had been sparked by the conversation with her friend Carol. Carol had shown Sarah that living independently didn't mean abandoning her family. It simply meant creating space for herself within the fabric of her life. And that space was necessary, not just for her own happiness, but for the well-being of her relationships with those she loved. The more Sarah thought about it, the more she realized how much she had been missing. It wasn't that she didn't love her family, she adored them, but somewhere along the way, she had lost herself. The person she had been, the woman who loved to paint, who enjoyed quiet mornings with a cup of tea and a good book, who relished long walks in the park, that woman had disappeared under the weight of family responsibilities. Now, Sarah was determined to find her again. The first step in Sarah's journey back to herself was a simple decision. She would carve out time for herself each day, no matter how busy life became. She would wake up a little earlier, or find quiet moments in the afternoon when the grandchildren were at school, to dedicate to her own well-being. At first, this decision seemed small, almost insignificant. After all, what could an hour here or there really change? But Sarah quickly discovered that these moments, however brief, were transformative. They were a reminder that she still had control over her own life, that she could still choose how to spend her time, and that her happiness mattered. She began by setting aside an hour every morning just for herself. During that time, she would sit on her balcony, drink her tea, and read a few chapters of a book. Sometimes she would write in her journal, reflecting on the past few months and how much she had learned about herself. Other times she would simply sit in silence, allowing herself to feel the stillness that she had so often craved. That hour became sacred to Sarah. It was a time when she didn't have to worry about anyone else, when she didn't have to be a mother, a grandmother, or a caretaker. She could just be Sarah. As Sarah continued to make space for herself in her daily routine, she started to think about the things she had once loved to do but had abandoned over the years. One passion in particular kept coming to mind: painting. Sarah had always loved to paint. In her younger years, she had spent countless hours at her easel, losing herself in the vibrant colors and the flow of the brush across the canvas. But as life got busier, first with raising children, and then with caring for her husband in his later years, Sarah's painting supplies had been packed away and forgotten. Now, the idea of picking up a paintbrush again excited her. She imagined the feel of the paint on her fingers, the satisfaction of watching a blank canvas come to life under her hands. The thought of it filled her with a sense of possibility that she hadn't felt in a long time. So one day, after her morning hour of solitude, Sarah went into the attic and found her old painting supplies. The brushes were dusty, and the paints were a little dried up, but they still felt familiar in her hands. She set up her easel in the living room, near the window where the light was best, and began to paint. At first, her strokes were tentative. She hadn't painted in years, and it felt a bit like starting from scratch. But as the colors began to blend and take shape on the canvas, Sarah felt a sense of joy bubbling up inside her. It was as if a part of her that had been dormant for so long was finally waking up. She painted for hours that day, losing track of time as the canvas filled with vibrant hues of blues, greens, and yellows. When she finally stepped back to look at her work, she smiled. It wasn't perfect, it was a little rough around the edges and the composition wasn't quite right, but it was hers. It was a piece of herself, brought to life after years of being buried. As Sarah rediscovered her love for painting, she realized that she wanted to take her passion a step further. She didn't just want to paint at home, she wanted to learn more, to refine her skills, and to connect with other people who shared her love for art. So, Sarah signed up for a painting class at the local community center. It was a small class, mostly made up of retirees like herself, but it was exactly what she needed. The first time she walked into the classroom, she felt a surge of excitement and a little bit of nervousness. She hadn't been a student in years, and the idea of learning something new at her age felt both thrilling and daunting. But the moment Sarah dipped her brush into the paint and started working on her first class project, all of her doubts melted away. She was doing something she loved, something that was just for her, and that was enough. The class became a weekly highlight for Sarah. She made new friends, learned new techniques, and found herself constantly inspired by the creativity of those around her. And most importantly, she felt like she was growing again, like she was rediscovering parts of herself that she had long forgotten. When Sarah first told her family about the painting class, they were surprised. Rebecca, in particular, hadn't realized how much her mother had been missing a creative outlet. At first, there was a bit of confusion. After all, Sarah had always been so dedicated to the family, and the idea of her spending time on herself was new for everyone. But as the weeks went by, and Sarah continued to paint and attend her classes, her family began to see the positive changes in her. She was happier, more energetic, and more engaged in life than she had been in years. The quiet moments of solitude, combined with the creative outlet of painting, had reignited a spark in Sarah that everyone could see. The grandchildren loved hearing about her classes, and they often asked to see her latest work. "Grandma, can you teach us to paint?" they would ask, their eyes wide with curiosity. And Sarah, smiling, would set up a small easel for each of them, guiding them through their first brushstrokes. Rebecca, too, was supportive of her mother's newfound passion. "I'm so glad you're doing this, Mom," she said one evening as they sat together after dinner. "You've spent so much time taking care of us. I think it's wonderful that you're doing something just for yourself." Sarah felt a deep sense of gratitude for her family's understanding. She had been worried that they wouldn't understand her need for independence, but they had surprised her by being both supportive and encouraging. As Sarah continued to paint and carve out time for herself, she realized that reclaiming her independence wasn't just about doing things for herself. It was about rediscovering who she was. She had spent so many years living for others that she had forgotten what it meant to live for herself. But now, she was starting to remember. Each morning, as Sarah sat on her balcony or picked up her paintbrush, she felt a sense of liberation that she hadn't experienced in years. She was no longer bound by the unspoken expectations of family life. She was free to make her own choices, to follow her own passions, and to live life on her own terms. It wasn't that Sarah loved her family any less. In fact, her love for them had deepened, but now, that love was balanced with a love for herself. She had learned that taking care of herself didn't mean neglecting her family. It meant ensuring that she had the energy, the joy, and the fulfillment to continue being the best mother and grandmother she could be. What Sarah didn't realize at first was that her decision to reclaim her independence was having a ripple effect on the people around her. Rebecca, who had always admired her mother's dedication to the family, began to think more about her own life. She started to question whether she, too, had been neglecting her own needs in favor of her responsibilities. Inspired by her mother's example, Rebecca decided to take up a hobby of her own. She joined a yoga class, something she had always wanted to do but had never made time for. And just like Sarah, Rebecca found that taking time for herself made her a better, more present mother to her children. Even the grandchildren were affected by Sarah's decision. They saw their grandmother not just as a caregiver, but as a vibrant, creative individual with her own passions and interests. They learned, through her example, that it was important to pursue your own dreams, no matter how old you were. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah's life transformed in ways she hadn't expected. She had started this journey hoping to find a bit of freedom and happiness, but what she had found was so much more. She had found herself again, Sarah's story is a reminder that independence isn't something that we either have or don't have. It's a lifelong journey. It's something that we must continually work to reclaim and protect, no matter where we are in life. For Sarah, reclaiming her independence didn't mean abandoning her family or giving up her role as a mother and grandmother. It simply meant finding a balance between the two, between being there for the people she loved and being there for herself. In the end, Sarah realized that true freedom wasn't about where she lived or who she lived with. It was about having the courage to live life on her own terms. And that was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her days. Part 6. The family changes too. As Sarah embarked on her journey to reclaim her independence, she wasn't the only one who experienced a transformation. What began as a quiet personal revolution within her heart soon rippled through her family, changing not just her life, but theirs as well. At first, Sarah hadn't anticipated that her decision to live more fully for herself would have such a profound effect on the people she loved. She had feared that prioritizing her own needs might distance her from her family. But what actually happened was the complete opposite. When Sarah began to carve out time for herself, setting aside moments for her own hobbies, personal growth, and quiet reflection, her family noticed the change immediately. It was subtle at first, perhaps just a brighter smile on her face or the way she moved with more energy and purpose. But gradually, it became clear that Sarah's decision to live more authentically had improved not only her mood, but also her relationships with her loved ones. For years, Sarah had felt trapped by the unspoken obligations of family life. Every day seemed to revolve around the needs of her daughter Rebecca and her grandchildren. She had loved being so involved in their lives, but it had come at a cost. Her sense of self had faded. However, now that Sarah had started to regain her autonomy, the dynamics within the household began to shift. One of the first changes Sarah noticed was how her family responded to her newfound sense of independence. At first, they were surprised, especially Rebecca. She had grown accustomed to her mother always being available, always willing to help with the children or manage the household. But as Sarah began to set boundaries, prioritizing her own time and activities, Rebecca and the children began to see Sarah not just as a caregiver, but as an individual with her own needs, passions, and desires. And with that realization came something unexpected: respect. Rebecca, in particular, started to respect her mother's time in a way she hadn't before. Instead of assuming Sarah would always be there to help at a moment's notice, Rebecca began to ask for her mother's availability, offering her a choice in how she wanted to spend her days. This small but significant change made a world of difference to Sarah. It showed her that her family valued her not just for the things she did for them, but for who she was as a person. The children, too, noticed the change. They had always adored their grandmother, but now they saw her in a new light. She wasn't just the person who cooked their meals or helped with their homework. She was a vibrant, creative woman who had her own interests and activities. They began to admire her even more for her independence and for the way she balanced her love for them with her love for herself. One of the most profound changes that occurred as Sarah embraced her independence was the shift in how the family's time together was experienced. In the past, Sarah had often felt like her presence was more of an obligation than a choice. She was always there, always involved, but there was a sense of duty underlying her interactions with her family. It wasn't that she didn't love spending time with them. She did, but the constant pressure to be available had made those moments feel less joyful. Now, however, things were different. By taking time for herself and setting clear boundaries, Sarah was no longer overwhelmed by the constant demands of family life. She could choose when she wanted to spend time with Rebecca and the grandchildren, and because of that, those moments became more precious. Instead of feeling like she had to be there, Sarah now felt like she wanted to be there. The family's gatherings, once routine, became something to look forward to. Whether it was a simple dinner together or a weekend outing to the park, Sarah found herself fully present in those moments, enjoying the laughter and conversations in a way she hadn't before. The weight of obligation had been lifted, and in its place was a genuine sense of joy. For Rebecca, this change was also noticeable. She saw that her mother was happier, more relaxed, and more engaged when they were together. It made their time together feel more meaningful, and Rebecca found herself cherishing these moments in a way she hadn't before. No longer was it just another dinner or another weekend. These were special times, filled with warmth and connection. One of the biggest challenges Sarah faced in her journey to reclaim her independence was learning to let go of the guilt she had carried for so long. For years, she had equated love with sacrifice, believing that in order to be a good mother and grandmother, she had to give up her own desires and dreams. But as she began to prioritize her own well-being, Sarah realized that this wasn't true. In fact, by taking care of herself and nurturing her own passions, Sarah found that she had even more love to give to her family. She wasn't depleted or exhausted anymore. She was energized, excited about life, and that energy spilled over into her relationships with Rebecca and the grandchildren. Sarah learned that love didn't have to come at the expense of her own happiness. She could love her family deeply while still loving herself. Letting go of that guilt wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And as Sarah let go of the belief that she had to sacrifice everything for her family, she found a new sense of freedom that allowed her to be even more present and loving than before. From Rebecca's perspective, watching her mother embrace her independence was both inspiring and eye-opening. At first, Rebecca had worried that her mother's decision to focus more on herself might create distance between them. She had grown so used to relying on Sarah for help that the idea of her mother setting boundaries felt unfamiliar. But as the weeks went by, Rebecca began to see the positive impact it had on their relationship. Her mother was happier, more fulfilled, and their interactions were no longer tinged with the subtle tension that had once existed. Instead of feeling like she was burdening her mother, Rebecca now felt like they were both choosing to spend time together. Because they wanted to, not because they had to. It wasn't just Rebecca who noticed the change. The grandchildren, too, started to appreciate their grandmother's newfound joy. They loved hearing about her painting classes and seeing her artwork. Sometimes, they would sit with her in the living room, watching as she worked on a new canvas, fascinated by the colors and shapes coming to life before their eyes. "Grandma, can you teach me how to paint?" one of the children asked one afternoon, their eyes wide with curiosity. Sarah smiled and nodded, setting up a small easel for her grandchild next to her own. As they painted together, Sarah realized that this was exactly what she had been missing, sharing her passions with her family, not just her time. As Sarah continued to live more independently, something surprising happened. Her decision to prioritize herself began to inspire those around her. Rebecca, who had always admired her mother's selflessness, began to realize that she, too, had been neglecting her own needs. Watching her mother find joy and fulfillment in her personal pursuits made Rebecca reflect on her own life. "I think I need to start doing something for myself, too," Rebecca said one evening as they sat together after dinner. "I've been so focused on work and the kids that I've forgotten what it's like to have a hobby." Sarah smiled, recognizing the same realization she had come to not so long ago. "It's never too late to start," she said gently. "You deserve to do things that make you happy too." Inspired by her mother's example, Rebecca decided to join a local yoga class, a small step, but one that made a big difference in her life. Like Sarah, she found that taking time for herself didn't make her any less of a mother. In fact, it made her a better one. The time she spent in class, focusing on her own well-being, left her feeling refreshed and more present for her children. The grandchildren, too, were learning valuable lessons from their grandmother's journey. They saw that independence didn't mean loving someone any less. It simply meant creating space for yourself within the relationships you cherish. They admired their grandmother for her creativity, her strength, and her willingness to pursue her passions, even in her later years. As the months passed, Sarah's relationship with her family continued to evolve. The quiet pressures that had once weighed her down were gone, replaced by a new dynamic of mutual respect and understanding. Sarah was no longer just a caregiver. She was a woman with her own life, her own dreams, and her own sense of purpose. And this new dynamic made their time together even more meaningful. Every dinner, every conversation, every shared moment felt like a choice to be together, to enjoy each other's company, and to celebrate the love that had always been at the heart of their family. For Sarah, this was the ultimate gift. She had feared that by choosing to live for herself, she might lose the closeness she had with her family. But in reality, the opposite had happened. By reclaiming her independence, Sarah had deepened her relationships with those she loved. She had shown them that love wasn't about sacrificing yourself. It was about sharing your true self with others. Sarah's journey to reclaim her independence didn't just change her life. It changed the lives of everyone around her. Her family, once so accustomed to the idea of her always being there, had learned to respect and appreciate her for who she was as an individual, not just for the roles she played in their lives. And Sarah, in turn, had rediscovered a sense of joy, freedom, and purpose that she hadn't felt in years. She had learned that it was never too late to start living for herself, to pursue her passions, and to create a life that was truly her own. In the end, Sarah's decision to prioritize her own happiness didn't just strengthen her. It strengthened her family too. It taught them the value of independence, the importance of balance, and the beauty of living authentically. And as they all sat together one evening, laughing and sharing stories, Sarah realized that this was what true happiness looked like. Not the constant caregiving, not the unspoken obligations, but the simple, beautiful moments of connection, made all the more special because they were shared out of love, not duty. Looking ahead, Sarah knew that her journey was far from over. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt, and more lessons to learn. But she also knew that she was no longer afraid to live life on her own terms. Her family had changed, and so had she. And together, they had created something truly beautiful. A new kind of closeness, built on mutual respect, independence, and unconditional love. In the end, Sarah's story wasn't just about finding freedom. It was about finding balance, about learning to live for yourself without losing the people you love. And that, Sarah realized, was the greatest gift of all. Part 7. The Important Conversation. One evening, Sarah sat quietly in her room, reflecting on the changes she had made in her life over the past few months. She had begun to rediscover herself, carve out time for her passions, and slowly reclaim the independence she had lost over the years. Yet, despite all these positive changes, there was one important step she hadn't yet taken: talking to her daughter Rebecca about her decision to live more independently. For months, Sarah had tiptoed around the idea, feeling conflicted. She knew that Rebecca valued her presence in the house, and that for Rebecca, having her mother nearby was a great comfort. But Sarah also knew that this situation wasn't sustainable, at least not in the way it had been. Sarah needed to be honest with herself and with her daughter. It was time for a conversation, a real one, about what living independently would mean for both of them. That night, after dinner, Sarah lingered at the kitchen table while Rebecca put the children to bed. As she sat there, she tried to gather her thoughts. What exactly did she want to say? How would Rebecca react? Sarah feared that her daughter might feel abandoned, or worse, that she might see Sarah's decision as a rejection of their family life. But Sarah also knew that the longer she waited to talk about this, the more difficult it would become. When Rebecca returned to the kitchen, Sarah took a deep breath. "Rebecca, can we talk?" she asked, her voice calm but steady. Rebecca looked at her mother, sensing that this wasn't just an ordinary conversation. She sat down across from Sarah, her face a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Of course, Mom. What's on your mind?" Sarah paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. I've been thinking a lot about my life lately, she began, her voice soft but resolute. And I've realized that, as much as I love being here with you and the kids, I need to start focusing more on myself. I need to find my own space again, to live independently. There was a long silence as Rebecca absorbed her mother's words. The kitchen, usually filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation, now seemed unnervingly quiet. Rebecca blinked a few times, clearly taken aback by what her mother had said. At first, Rebecca didn't know how to respond. Her initial reaction was one of confusion and worry. But Mom, why would you want to leave? I thought you were happy here with us, she said, her voice tinged with concern. Are we doing something wrong? Is this because of the kids? Sarah smiled gently, shaking her head. No, sweetheart, it's not about you or the kids. You've been wonderful, and I love being with you all. But this is about me. I've spent so much time taking care of everyone else that I've forgotten to take care of myself. And as much as I enjoy being here, I need to find a balance between being with my family and having time for myself. Rebecca sat back in her chair, still processing her mother's words. I just don't understand, Mom. We've been so happy having you here. The kids love having you around, and I don't know what we'd do without you. Sarah reached across the table and took Rebecca's hand. I know, honey, and I'm not saying I'm going to disappear. I'm still going to be here for you and the kids, but I need some space. I need to live my own life, to pursue my own interests, and to have the freedom to come and go as I please. It's something I've been thinking about for a while now, and I believe it's the right decision for me. Rebecca looked down at her mother's hand, a wave of emotions washing over her. On one hand, she understood what her mother was saying. After all, Sarah had been doing so much for the family, often at the expense of her own happiness. But on the other hand, Rebecca couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. The thought of her mother no longer living with them, no longer being there every day, was difficult to accept. But what if something happens to you, Mom? Rebecca asked, her voice trembling slightly. What if you get sick, or you need help? I won't be there to take care of you. Sarah's heart ached at the worry in her daughter's voice. She knew that Rebecca's concerns came from a place of love and protectiveness, but Sarah also knew that this was a conversation they needed to have. I understand your worries, Rebecca, and I appreciate how much you care about me. But I'm not fragile, and I don't want you to feel like you have to take care of me all the time. I'm still capable of living on my own and making my own decisions. I need to do this, not just for myself, but for both of us. Rebecca wiped away a tear that had formed in the corner of her eye. I just don't want you to feel like you're alone, Mom. We've always been so close, and I don't want that to change. Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand gently, her voice filled with reassurance. Sweetheart, our closeness isn't going to change. If anything, I believe this will make our relationship even stronger. I'm not leaving because I don't want to be near you. I'm doing this because I want to be the best version of myself, for both you and for me. I want to be a mother and a grandmother who is happy, fulfilled, and living life to the fullest. And in order to do that, I need to take this step. Rebecca nodded slowly, her expression softening as she began to understand where her mother was coming from. I guess I never really thought about it like that, she admitted. You've always been so giving, always there for us, and I just assumed that's how things would always be. Sarah smiled, her eyes filled with love and understanding. And I'll always be here for you, Rebecca. But I've realized that I need to be here for myself too. I want to show you and the kids that it's never too late to pursue your passions, to live your own life, and to find happiness in new ways. This isn't the end of anything, it's the beginning of something new. As the conversation continued, Rebecca's initial fears and worries began to fade. She realized that her mother wasn't pulling away from the family, but rather, she was finding a way to reconnect with herself. And in doing so, Sarah was teaching Rebecca an invaluable lesson about independence, self-care, and the importance of living authentically. Rebecca smiled through her tears, finally understanding. "Mom, I'm proud of you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "It takes a lot of courage to do what you're doing, to take back your life like this. I want you to be happy, and if this is what you need, then I support you completely." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had been so worried about how Rebecca would react, but now, sitting here at the kitchen table with her daughter, she realized that this conversation was exactly what they both needed. It was a turning point, not just for Sarah, but for their entire family. "I'm glad we talked about this," Sarah said softly. "I didn't want you to feel like I was leaving, or that I didn't want to be part of your lives. I just need to create some space for myself, to rediscover who I am outside of being a mother and grandmother." Rebecca nodded, her face brightening. "I get it now, Mom, and I want you to know that I'm here for you, just like you've always been here for me. We'll figure this out together." As the conversation drew to a close, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. She had been honest with her daughter, and Rebecca had responded with love and understanding. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like she was truly in control of her own life. She wasn't just living for her family anymore. She was living for herself, too. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Rebecca worked together to make the transition as smooth as possible. They discussed practical matters, finding a new place for Sarah to live, setting up a schedule for family visits, and making sure that Sarah would still be an integral part of the children's lives. But they also spent time talking about the deeper emotional aspects of this change, how their relationship would evolve, how they could support each other, and how this new chapter would strengthen their bond. For Sarah, this wasn't just about moving out. It was about moving forward. She was reclaiming her independence, rediscovering her passions, and finding joy in the simple things that had once brought her so much happiness. And for Rebecca, this was an opportunity to see her mother in a new light, as a woman with her own dreams and desires, someone who was strong, capable, and full of life. As Sarah prepared to move into her own space, she reflected on how far she had come. She had spent so many years giving everything to her family, and while she had loved every moment of it, she now realized that there was more to life than just being a caregiver. She could be both a loving mother and grandmother, and a woman with her own life, her own dreams, and her own sense of purpose. And as she looked around the room at her daughter and grandchildren, Sarah smiled, knowing that this wasn't the end of their closeness. It was just the beginning of a new kind of family, one built on love, respect, and the understanding that everyone deserves the freedom to live their own life. With Rebecca's support, Sarah knew that she could embark on this next chapter of her life with confidence. She wasn't just finding independence, she was finding herself. And in doing so, she was giving her family the greatest gift she could offer, the example of a life lived fully with passion, purpose, and love. Conclusion. As we reach the end of Sarah's story, we are reminded of an important truth. Growing older doesn't mean we have to give up who we are. It doesn't mean we must surrender our passions, our dreams, or our independence. Sarah's journey is a powerful testament to the fact that independence and freedom remain crucial at every stage of life, including our later years. Sarah had spent decades devoted to her family, raising children, caring for grandchildren, and finding joy in the role of a mother and grandmother. But she also learned that there is a time when we must look inward, a time when we must rediscover ourselves. Her story reflects a journey that many people experience. The balance between love for family and the need for personal freedom. For so long, Sarah had been wrapped up in the needs of her family, putting their happiness above her own. And while there's nothing wrong with selflessness, there is also nothing wrong with taking a step back and saying, "It's time for me now." Sarah learned this the hard way. Through the quiet pressures, the unspoken obligations, and the constant feeling of being on call for everyone else. Her life became a reflection of other people's needs, rather than her own desires and aspirations. But in taking that brave step to reclaim her independence, Sarah rediscovered a joy she hadn't felt in years. she realized that independence didn't mean she loved her family any less. In fact, it allowed her to love them more freely, without the weight of obligation clouding her happiness. And in doing so, she found a deeper sense of fulfillment. Her story teaches us that even in old age, we have the right and the power to live for ourselves. We can still discover new passions, explore new opportunities, and embrace new experiences. Life doesn't stop as we grow older. It simply changes shape, offering us new ways to find meaning and joy. One of the hardest parts of Sarah's journey was confronting the fear of change. For so long, she had believed that living close to her family was the only way to find happiness in her later years. But as time went on, she realized that this closeness was also the source of her greatest frustration. It was robbing her of the independence she once cherished. Change is always difficult, especially when it involves redefining long-held beliefs about family, love, and responsibility. Sarah had to face her fear of upsetting her daughter, of being seen as selfish, and of stepping into the unknown. But what she discovered on the other side of that fear was a new kind of freedom. A freedom that allowed her to live fully on her own terms. Her journey reminds us that we shouldn't be afraid of change, even when it feels uncomfortable. Sometimes, the greatest transformations happen when we are willing to step outside of our comfort zone and embrace the uncertainty of something new. For Sarah, freedom wasn't just about moving into her own space or having more time for herself. It was about reclaiming the parts of her life that had been pushed aside for too long. It was about remembering who she was before she became a mother and a grandmother. It was about reconnecting with her passions, her hobbies, and the dreams she had let go of over the years. This newfound freedom allowed Sarah to become more than just a caregiver. It allowed her to be her own person again. She was no longer defined solely by her role in the family. She became an artist, a friend, a woman with her own unique perspective on life. And in doing so, she showed her family that true love isn't about sacrificing yourself for others. It's about living fully and authentically so that you can bring the best version of yourself to those you care about. Sarah's decision to live independently wasn't about creating distance between her and her family. It was about creating a healthier balance. By giving herself the space to grow, she was able to bring more joy, more energy, and more love to her relationships with her daughter and grandchildren. The time they spent together became more meaningful, more intentional, because Sarah was no longer weighed down by the pressures of everyday caregiving. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of Sarah's journey is the legacy she leaves behind. Through her courage to live independently, she taught her family an invaluable lesson about the importance of self-care, personal growth, and living with intention. She showed them that independence is not something we outgrow with age. It's something we must nurture throughout our lives. For her daughter Rebecca, Sarah's story became a source of inspiration. Rebecca saw her mother blossom into a woman who embraced her passions, who found joy in her own company, and who lived life with a renewed sense of purpose. It made Rebecca question her own life, her own sense of balance, and her own desires for the future. Sarah's journey became a reminder that we are never too old to pursue our dreams, to set boundaries, and to live life for ourselves. For Sarah's grandchildren, the lessons were just as profound. They saw their grandmother not as someone who was growing weaker with age, but as someone who was growing stronger in her sense of self. They learned that independence and family are not mutually exclusive, that you can love deeply while still maintaining your own identity. They witnessed firsthand the power of living authentically, and they carried that lesson forward into their own lives. So now, we turn to you, the viewer. Sarah's story may have been about her personal journey, but the lessons she learned apply to all of us. Whether you are a mother, a father, a grandmother, or a grandfather, the question remains the same. Are you living your life for yourself, or are you living according to the expectations of others? It's never too late to reclaim your freedom, to rediscover your passions, and to live your life on your own terms. It doesn't matter how old you are or where you are in your life, there is always time to make a change. Don't let fear hold you back. Don't let guilt stop you from pursuing the life you truly want. As Sarah's story shows, independence and family can coexist. You can love your family deeply while still honoring your own needs and desires. The path to true happiness lies not in sacrificing yourself for others, but in finding a balance that allows you to thrive. So ask yourself, are you ready to take that step? Are you ready to embrace the freedom that comes with living authentically? As we conclude this story, we are left with a sense of hope and possibility. Sarah's journey didn't end when she decided to live independently. It was just the beginning. She discovered new passions, built new friendships, and deepened her relationships with her family in ways she never thought possible. And her story reminds us that the journey to reclaiming our freedom is ongoing. It's a journey that requires courage, self-reflection, and a willingness to embrace change. But it's a journey worth taking because the reward is a life filled with meaning, purpose, and joy. So as you reflect on Sarah's story, take a moment to consider your own life. Are there areas where you've given up your independence? Are there passions you've set aside, waiting for the right time to pursue them? And most importantly, are you ready to make a change? The choice is yours. And like Sarah, you have the power to reclaim your freedom and live a life that is truly your own. As we wrap up Sarah's inspiring journey, I want to leave you with a final thought. The power to reclaim your freedom, your happiness, and your sense of self is always within reach. Sarah's story is just one example of how we can all find the courage to live life on our own terms, no matter our age or circumstances. Now, if this story has resonated with you, if it has stirred something within you or given you a fresh perspective on your own life, don't keep it to yourself. Let's continue this journey together. Hit that like button if you believe in the importance of living life authentically, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories that challenge the way we think about life, love, and independence. Together, we'll explore how to embrace change, find balance, and create a life that truly reflects who we are. Share this video with your friends and loved ones, because you never know who might be feeling stuck, lost, or overwhelmed by the responsibilities in their life. Sometimes, all it takes is one story, like Sarah's, to spark a change, to remind someone that it's never too late to start living for themselves again. So let's spread this message of empowerment, freedom, and joy. We're on this journey together, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told. Stay with us, and together, we'll continue to discover the strength within ourselves to live life fully. Are you ready for the next chapter? Hit that bell notification to never miss a new video.